Okay, everyone. So, thank you. Welcome to Lives on the Fringes of Society, where we're at today. And we're talking about the freedom of innovation, the freedom to think for yourself, and the art of living life and conducting business in a very different way. This is going to be a real interesting class for a lot of us, especially as we explore life and as we explore business from this perspective of living life on the edges of society. And a lot of times when we think of if I ask you what you think off the grid or maybe a fringe lifestyle is, you're probably going to have a very narrow perspective of this. And this is going to be a person who's probably a doomsday prepper, or maybe somebody who lives out in the middle of nowhere. Maybe they do van life. Maybe they do all sorts of stuff, right? There's countless of examples, and these are just a few of them. But the real heart of the matter is, what does it mean to apply that to our everyday life? That's the real question. The business that we do, the thoughts that we think, the relationships that we have. What does this mean to live life on the fringes, away from the traditional norms that we're seeing every single day and that we're told to follow, right? What does it mean to live truly free and be happy and content, as opposed to just following a well-made plan? And that's kind of the syllabus, if you will, of this entire class, is to teach you how to think broadly and think widely, and to give you a new perspective on life in general, and how you can apply these very uncommon but practical perspectives into your daily work and into your life as a whole. So that's kind of what this whole thing is about. Okay, so what does it mean to live freely? Okay, I want to give you an example of this. Okay, so one time while researching a story, while researching something that I was working on, I decided that I needed to go out. I was doing this particular story about people who were homeless and economically challenged, right? Very difficult story to do, especially when you had the comfort of knowing that you had a home to go back to, right? So you had money, you had resources, you had everything that you could imagine. So what I did is I did something that was kind of unconventional. I went out to a completely new city. I broke the law, completely broke the law, broke every rule. I left my ID at home, left my bank card at home, my credit card at home, took no cash with me to a completely different city. Got a bus. This was back when you could still travel by Greyhound bus without identification. And I went to a completely different city, away from everybody, bound and determined that I was going to try to put myself in this situation that I was very uncomfortable with and very unfamiliar with. So I traveled to this location, to Austin, Texas, where there were a lot of homeless people. And I began to live with the homeless people, and I began to engage with the people there who were economically challenged, living on the streets. I didn't have any money, and I had to learn how they lived, the experiences that they had. This is a very, ultimately the story ended up coming out where I would earn a few bucks. I think close to $1,000 doing day labor and stuff, and living in parks and on the streets and everything else, right? Out with these folks every single day. And it teaches you a lot of new skills, right? It really does. It teaches you how to survive, and it teaches you how to get by, right? You learn a lot from this. But more importantly, I ended up saving some money, being able to get myself back home, get myself back up on my feet, and, do back up on my feet, right? And seeing how this worked. But through this process of living differently, I learned to live freely. I learned to live very differently than what the status quo might tell me to live by. Okay? So I want you to think about this. When have you lived truly differently in your life, and what did it teach you? Now, it may not be as drastic as going to a completely different city and being homeless for, 2 months to get the story. But it might be something where, you got a tattoo, or you went to a different denomination of church for a while, or, you did something different than what everybody was telling you you should do. What did you learn from it? What did you gain from it? I bet if you stop to reflect on this question, you're going to find out that you probably learned a lot more than you realized you learned at the time. Really. So I want to ask that question to you. Okay, so why do we even bother studying the fringes of society anyway? I mean, you could probably make all sorts of arguments that there's better examples of things to study out there, but as I pointed out here, societal mirrors is one of the things that studying these fringe groups and these fringe societal movements really show us, right? Because oftentimes these fringe groups mirror society and what's really going on in the greater civilization, if you will. For instance, if you watch the movie, and I watched this just yesterday with my wife, Nomadland, and it's a movie's been out a few years, and it shows how people are moving away from society, and older folks are being forced into this van life world or this RV life world because it's often the cheapest way to do it. If you do it out of necessity and not out of want, right? And it kind of chronicles the life of this lady who goes from living a pretty comfortable life. She was, if you haven't seen the movie, I suggest you do it. But she's in her 60s, and she goes and, she's working as a substitute teacher. I think she worked in HR for a while. Her husband worked for a gypsum mine that went out of business, and he dies, and she lives in a track house, and she loses it, and she ends up living in a van to go to work for Amazon at a distribution center. She does that for a while, and then she kind of travels around, meets the YouTuber Bob Wells, and it's a great story, but it mirrors society because this is a real thing that's going on in society. So shows like Nomadland or Into the Wild, the story of Christopher McCandless. This is a much older movie. They teach us about how society is changing. So it acts as a mirror. It reflects the real truth of what's going on in our society. But more importantly than that, it shows us value. It shows us the value of things that we hold important to us. Things like freedom. Things like the ability to work, the ability to have money, the ability to have a family, to offer them a comfortable life, whatever it is, right? These fringe groups teach us that. But more importantly, they show us the value of the things that we often overlook. I think it was the American songwriter Chris Christopherson that wrote the song Me and Bobby McGee. And he said, freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. Nothing ain't worth nothing, but it's free. It's one of my favorite quotes. You'll hear me say that a lot. Maybe not in this class, but you'll hear me say it a lot. But we learn by looking at these fringe groups and these fringe lifestyles about the things that we often forget. And then we often learn innovation from them because sometimes they live in worlds that don't often have as much as you and I have, right? So, excuse me. By looking at this, we can see how we can innovate better. Let's take tech, for instance. There's an abundance of technology out there. We're kind of at the end of the life cycle. People say that we're living in the golden age of technology. But I think we're starting to realize that we're at the limits of our technology, especially if you're on the consumer side of it, right? You're getting sick of seeing all this. Every day something new pops up, and it's useless. It's just a reinvention of something else that was already out there. Well, reinvention is not innovation. Reinvention is re-innovation. You're reimagining something that already exists. What's the point in that? Nobody wants that. Nobody cares. It's just another useless tool for you to learn. So, because technology is so abundant, there's no real scarcity in it. So, what are you going to do that doesn't reinvent the wheel? That's the real question. What are you going to do that's not reinventing what already exists? I want to create a real innovator here, not just a copycat. All right, so now let's apply this to the liberal arts perspective, okay? Because liberal arts is not what most people think, okay? Most people come into liberal arts thinking that it's, political or some weird thing, and it's really not, right? It has nothing to do with your political beings. And we can have this hopefully you've already taken the introduction to liberal arts class. But at its core, liberal arts asks why, not just how, right? This whole concept of liberal arts invites multiple perspectives, multiple ideas, multiple entry points for engagement. We're talking philosophy, art, literature, lived experience, all sorts of things, right? So we're going to use this fringe movement, right? And this fringe lifestyle as a way for you to understand what you can do differently. And we're going to apply the liberal arts lens to this. So the fringe that you keep hearing me talk about, right? This fringe becomes the big, 70 to 200 millimeter lens for exploring meaning, for exploring ethics, for exploring our creativity. And you're not just reinventing the damn Ferris wheel. You're actually doing something that's new and taking people on a new experience and giving them something that's truly very different, like the first iPhone when it came out, right? Not just what we have today, thinner, thicker, quicker, blah, 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 blah. They've run out of ideas. They've run out of battery power. They've run out of brain power to really innovate something new. And when the iPhone came out, they were reinventing something. They were creating something. They were innovating something. Now it's just another cheap imitation of the last version expensive imitation of the last version of phone that they came out with only minor changes. Why? Because they've lost the liberal arts perspective. At first, Steve Jobs had the fringe idea. And it worked. And he changed society with it. Now, I guess Apple's just kind of ran out of ideas because they've ran out of battery space. But that's a whole another topic. So as we continue this course, I want you to think of this from this liberal arts perspective. That's the point of this course, right? So think of it like that. Okay, so in your handouts and in the syllabus, I've given you a couple of videos from this character called Hobo Shoestring. Mark Nichols. God, absolutely tragic story. Tragic story. The way his life ended, horrible. And no, he didn't fall off a train and die. No, he didn't. But there's a whole... They found him in the bottom of a lake near his home. It's absolutely tragic ending to this story. And I want you... But I've spent probably the past 3 years following the adventures of Hobo Shoestring because I'm a fan of hoboism, if that's a word, on the trains. And I've always thought that, if I was going to live this life, I would be a hobo. And but I was watching this because I love trains, and then when I heard this story about him losing his life and all of this, Hobo Shoestring lived on the fringes. His name was Mark Nichols, and Shoestring lived on the fringes of society. He had Asperger's, and he served in the military, in the army, and he became a train rider, a hobo, if you will. Traveled all over the country, had these great adventures, had a wonderful personality, struggled through alcoholism, addiction, all sorts of things, probably like a lot of the people in his community do. But the guy knew every possible thing he could know, that a person could know, about the trains and about the rails and about riding the rails and the history of riding the rails. But not only that, Hobo Shoestring taught us about survival, self-reliance, understanding life. He taught us about being a good person. He taught us where to find food, how to find jobs, how to tell which way a train is going without seeing the engine or which direction it's going. He taught us all sorts of things, And he made almost anyone believe that they could be a modern day train rider or hobo. But he also had more intelligence and more intellect than probably one of the best trained CEOs of one of the rail companies out there. I mean, this guy was absolutely genius. And so in the course description, in the links and in the syllabus, I've given you a couple of videos to watch about Hobo Shoestring. And I want you to watch this, and I want you to think about what he's teaching us about freedom. I want you to think about all of the lessons that Shoestring is teaching us here, because he is teaching us some very valuable lessons. And as you're watching these videos about Shoestring that he made here, I want you to think about what emotions come into your life. What judgments come into your mind as you watch this. But then also think about the skills that he's teaching you. The creativity when he found YouTube. His resilience. His passion for life. His passion for trains. And his passion from being away from society. I want you to think about all of the things that Hobo Shoestring has taught us and what we can learn from this guy. And it's not just Shoestring. I mean, there's plenty other ones out there. I'm just using Hobo Shoestring, Mark Nichols, as an example. But we can learn so much from him. And I don't even know if he realized how the inspiration that he was to people like me who love trains and the idea of being a train rider. But also the practical common sense. And I don't even know if he could have ever even been imagined he'd be the topic of a liberal arts class. But let's think about this. So I want you to think about the emotions and the judgments and the ideas that you get when you watch Hobo Shoestring, because it's fascinating stuff. So I've given you some adjunct reading to go with this course. In addition to watching just Hobo Shoestring and doing some research on Shoestring, I've also given you some more classic reading and some adjunct reading that I want you to do. And one of these is Henry David Thoreau in Civil Disobedience and Walden, some of Thoreau's greatest works, in my opinion. And Thoreau says, two quotes in here. I put one here on the slide. The mass of men, the large portion of society, lead lives of quiet desperation. Now there's so much to unpack in that quote, but if you think about it, what was he leaning towards? As you go back and you read Walden, I want you to think about what Thoreau was running away from. What was he running towards? What was he going to find? Another one of the interesting quotes from Thoreau is that a man should be prepared to leave his home with nothing more than the clothes on his back and be ready to survive. My God, could you imagine? I remember when I did my experiment with the homeless people, quite intimidating, very intimidating. It scared the hell out of me. Scared the absolute hell out of me. But it taught me a lot. And I was absolutely prepared to survive with nothing more than the clothes on my back. And I had to learn a lot. So what is Thoreau saying? How does Thoreau's idea, as you're reading this adjunct literature that I gave you, how does Thoreau's idea of voluntary simplicity apply to your life and your modern day projects that you're doing today? How does all this apply to all of this? How can you make your world a better place, your products better, your relationships stronger through this voluntary simplicity? You know, I have a little habit every morning. My wife is a public school teacher. She teaches 8th grade math. And I have this habit where I wake up every single morning and I fix her coffee for her and I fix her lunch for her and I prepare her for her day, like almost like she's a child, getting ready to head out into the world, for school. I do these little things for her because it's a simple voluntary act. I don't do it out of obligation. I don't do it because she's incapable. I do it because I love her and that I care for her. And so it's a voluntary act that I do. So I want you to think about that, these voluntary acts, and how they resonate with us in our lives and where we're at today. So one of your adjunct readings is going to be Thoreau. So I want you to read that as well. So in addition to Hobo Shoestring, another one of the adjunct readings that I've given you here to look at is by a person named Bell Hooks. If you never stopped to read any of the works of Bell Hooks, she was a classic writer, but she was on the fringes of writing and literary science, and she was on this, discussed topics like feminism, and she discussed racism and segregation, and she was from Kentucky, having grew up in I think it was Brea, Kentucky, but she grew up in this small mid-southern town that was forged with racism, and she was a fringe person, and she was basically educated in a pretty radical segregated school. She was a beautiful mind, and she went on to be a professor and all this stuff. But it's kind of like the Supertramp song, be careful or they'll call you a radical, a liberal, whatever, all these different things that they'll call you, right? And that's perfectly fine, because when you start thinking outside of the traditional norms, that's when you start challenging those norms, right? So they'll start calling you, what does the song say, Supertramp? Some will call you logical, radical, a liberal, all kinds of stuff. This is what name calling is, what they resort to when you challenge them, right? Okay, and Bell Hooks was a great example of this. But you have to be able to accept this. And I love this quote here by Bell Hooks, where she says, "The margin is a site of creativity and resistance. It's not a place of despair." You see, all too often in our lives, we look at the margins as being this scary place that we don't want to go to because it's sad. The safe place is reinvention. The safe place is doing what somebody else has already done and trying to tweak it a little bit. That's the safe place. But the real creative place, the real resistance, the real change, the real innovation comes from not just living there on the margins, but thriving on the margins. And that's the whole purpose of these people. And of course, Bell Hooks was a feminist theorist, and that's great because she wrote some great works. I think there was a book, Ain't I a Woman, or Ain't I a Black Woman, or something like that. Ain't I a Woman? It was like being black and being a feminist. Absolutely wonderful book. I think you should read it. There was another one that was Teachings to Transgress. That was another great book she wrote. I haven't included them in the auxiliary or adjunct reading here, but I suggest you go and take a look at these things because they'll change your life. More importantly, they'll change your perspective on how you handle tasks. And that's what we want to get to the bottom of, how you can more effectively innovate as a change maker, whatever it is. So look, constraint does not breed conformity. Constraint breeds creativity. Okay, and that's what we're looking at here. You know, whether it's trying to come up with new ways to do something, new ideas, getting more out of the supplies that we have on hand, learning a new tool, learning a new idea, something that's not going to waste our time. Look, we spend a lot of time focusing on useless things that are junk. You know, learning a new software, learning a new programming language, learning this, learning that. These things are largely junk. What if you could really innovate something new? What if you could really bring something new to the table? Not just another Dropbox, cloud storage, cloud computing, whatever. You have to think outside the box. And that's what we're trying to get people to do. Because not enough of you people, especially you young people, are not thinking outside the box these days. You're not really innovating anymore. You're not constraining yourself and using that as creativity. And that's not knocking you. That's just the world that you live in. You know, we all lived in very different generations. So I want you to think about, how is life on the fringe a form of problem solving? Whether you're living in a van, whether you're living in an RV, or whether you're Charles Bronson disrupting the airline industry for a time. You know, or Herb Kelleher when he disrupted the airline industry with Southwest. What are you doing to disrupt traditional norms and challenge them and make them really useful in life? What are you doing? These people, believe it or not, Herb Kelleher was on the fringes. Richard Branson was on the fringes. Steve Jobs was on the fringes. Where are you at? What are you doing? Where are you at? Okay, so as we begin to kind of wrap this lecture up here for the night or for the week, I want us to go through here and remind ourselves that we're going to be seeing these things and these people without exploiting them. I don't want to make them entertainment. They're certainly not. Maybe there's a component of entertainment, but for you and I, and for the purposes of this class, it's not going to be looking at these people as entertainment. I view it more as a clinical research study, okay? And I want you to use it as that, either because, as I put here in the slide, just because we see somebody's life online or in literature or whatever it is, does not mean that we really understand that person's life. In my example earlier of Hobo Shoestring, Mark Nichols, I mean, this is a guy who had a lot of demons, right? He had a lot of problems, and he had a lot of things going on, maybe mentally and developmentally, whatever, right? Our job is not to understand that, but our job is to learn from him. And certainly we should not turn this into entertainment. I don't want you to do that because Hobo Shoestring deserves better than just being a piece of entertainment, right? And all of these people do. They're human. People who live on the fringes are still human, right? So because they're human, we need to treat them in their lives, either now or posthumously. We need to treat them with some humility, with some ethics. We can be curious about the lives that they live, right? We have to be. We should be. As critical thinkers, we should be curious about other people's lives. But we should also be ethical when we're asking these questions. And, we're not trying to humiliate them or make them look bad. That's the furthest thing should be the furthest thing from your mind. But what you should be doing is looking at these people and saying, what can I learn from them? They are your teacher. What can you learn from them? That's the most important thing, y'all. What can you learn from these folks? And when you can learn something from them and walk away from that, that's the biggest honor that you could ever give these people, is to learn from them. So let's learn from them with some humility and respect, okay? All right, so also to wrap this thing up, your assignment for this week is very simple. It's going to be a thought prompt, right? And it's the quote that freedom is not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of purpose. I want you to go out into the world today. I want you to think about that. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? I want you to drop me a comment and tell me why you agree or why you disagree about this. But before you answer that question, I want you to answer the bigger question, is how do people who live on the fringes, how do they and conduct business on the fringes, how do they redefine the word responsibility? How can you redefine the word responsibility? I want you to think before you answer this comment, freedom is not the absence of responsibility, but the presence of purpose. I want you to think about that before you answer it, and think about it long and hard, because that's applicable all the way across our global society today, okay? So don't drop me a comment with like, I agree, I disagree, whatever. Put some sense into it. I'll give you a big flat goose egg for this one, right? With a slash through it. So don't be doing that, okay? So all right, everybody. So this is the first lecture. I appreciate you sticking through this. Send me an email. My email's in the syllabus. If you have any questions. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot. Take care.